Hi, welcome to Board Gems, my regular video series in which I talk about older board game gems. We're just past around about the 1 year anniversary of Board Gems, and one viewer suggested I do a mailbag episode, so I did a call out for questions, and I got so many questions I had to split them up into different episodes, different topics. But one question in particular deserves an episode all its own. And the question is, do you want to make any predictions about what trends might be popular over the coming 5 to 10 years? No. Thanks for watching. Remember, older board... No, because I don't want to call them predictions. First of all, it's a fascinating question, and thank you to the person who sent that question in. You know, predictions are a tricky thing, because I think it's fun and interesting to think about and talk about where the hobby is headed, what direction, what might we see in 5 years or 10 years. But I also know that some people do predictions and then they're like, whoa, let's see if I was right. And then they go back and it's like, well, looks like I got 2 out of 10 right. Right? I don't want to hear, 5 to 10 years later that all of these were wrong. Don't think of these as predictions. I think of them as possible futures. Directions that the hobby might go in. Ideas that I had, and want to share them with you. Okay, so possible future 1. And these are not separate. Like, some of these could all happen at the same time, right? But I need to separate them somehow. So, bullet points. So, possible future 1. A contraction of the board game market. Now, honestly, this is something that has been predicted ever since I've been in the hobby, okay? Games, every year, more and more games come out. And every year, people who have been in the hobby a long time look at this and go, this can't keep up, can it? We can't just keep growing and growing and growing forever. Like, at some point, there has to be a contraction. And you could argue that Asmodee buying up some of these companies, absorbing these companies like, Days of Wonder and Fantasy Flight and all those ones, you could argue is a sort of contraction. The reason it's grown as much as it has is twofold. One is we've obviously lowered the bar in terms of new companies, new people being able to release games, right? We no longer have the gatekeepers. We don't have the publishers saying that game's good, that game's crap. This game's amazing. Okay, we'll publish this one. No. Even that person who made the crap game, if they have enough confidence in it, and especially if they're good marketers, they can put it on Kickstarter, maybe they can still make their game. Maybe in the end it's still crap, but it'll have its fans. And so even though the market has grown a crazy amount in terms of the number of games being sold and produced, there still seems to be lots more people coming in and buying them. So honestly, there still has to be an upper limit, right? There has to be some point where just way too many games are on the market and aren't enough new people who are buying them to make it worthwhile for companies to be making all these games. And of course, when you combine that with the number of games that are coming out that are just tricked out and on Kickstarter, they're like $100, $200 when you add in all these minis, there's only so much board game money to go around, right? Somebody who spends $200 on a Kickstarter board game, that's $200 they're not spending on several smaller games that were still made and companies are trying to sell and now they can't, right? There aren't enough people buying them. So honestly, I still see a contraction, but they've been talking about a contraction for ever since I've been in the hobby, so over 15 years. So when is it going to happen? How is it going to happen? I don't know, but something's going to happen. There's way too much choice. And before you fancy capitalists out there get to me, it's like, well, choice is good, right? And it's good that companies, if they can't compete in the market, that they fold or whatever. Yeah, no. Because some of these games could be hits if just enough people were to try them and play them. But when there's too many games, not enough of them stand out. And the only way a game stands out is if it goes too far in one direction, right? So like, you have the games like Cool Minis or Not does, right? They have the big giant games with tons of minis that cost $200 or something, and some people will love that. Some people will always love that sort of thing. But maybe there was a nice, simple, light card game that was great, and it could have been a hit. If there were fewer games, the best games stand out more. And when there's too many games, too much choice, the games that stand out are not necessarily the games that are the best or the best to grow the hobby. They are sometimes just the games that stand out and attract the people who are most likely to spend money on games. They did the best job of attracting attention to the hobby market, from the hobbyists who spend the most money on games. And you could argue that some of those games grow the market. But I guess I'm coming from the point of view of the board games being the sort of the type of hobby or pastime that literally everybody on the planet could get into, right? And so I'm always thinking about that big picture, growing the board game hobby, growing the pastime, growing the industry to be more for everyone. And there are games, great games that come out now that absolutely have that potential that very few people will see or hear of. And that's a shame. You have small companies, small publishers that release a couple games a year. There used to be lots of companies like this. There are fewer. And their role will continue to decrease to almost nothing. And in the end, you're going to have basically two lanes, okay? There's going to be mass market games, or games that have the potential for mass market, like to grow the hobby. And then you're also going to have, on the other side, you're going to have the hobby market, right? And there's going to be very little overlap. The games that I like to promote on this channel often are games that could be in that overlap, right? Not all of them, but some of them, right? Games like Mexica. I did Mexica recently. That was a great example of a game that regular people and hobbyists could both enjoy on different levels. But what's going to happen is you're going to see less of those in-between games. You're going to have games that are either aimed at the mass market or potential for mass market, and you're going to have games that are just so totally focused on the hobby market. And those hobby games will be mostly Kickstarter. And on the other side, you're going to have Asmodee. And Asmodee will have a lot of the sort of what we used to call the gateway games, but I guess now are mass market games. But maybe not just Asmodee. Certainly, I look at companies like Ravensburger, like Cosmos, like Amigo, German companies that have decided to take a more active role than they used to in the English market. And I would actually be very surprised if we didn't see more coming out of Hasbro and Mattel. Now, Hasbro's always kind of been, had one leg in the hobby market via its acquisition of Wizards of the Coast. But, they've had a history of releasing some hobby games via Wizards of the Coast and Avalon Hill. And Mattel has had fits and starts. They've had some great games come out that only really got attention in the hobby market, but have a potential to be wider. But they've had some misfires. But, they had those, the Ghost Fighting Treasure Trackers, I think it's called. That won the Kinderspiel des Jahres. So Mattel has some success too. I would be surprised, or I would expect, and if I was head of Hasbro or Mattel, I would be doing this, is I would be really eyeing that. Maybe it's wrong to call it the hobby market. There is now a gap that needs filling. So you have the mass market and you have the hobby market, and you're seeing very little in between now. And you have companies like Hasbro and Mattel and Asmodee, of course, And they're focused on the mass market, but they can grow. And they can grow into what we would have used to think was the hobby space. But the hobby space has kind of left that space. So those companies can now expand their role. I guess my point is that there wasn't one big competitor, right? As long as your competitors are all scattered, they're all kind of doing their own little things, and none of them have any particularly large amount of market share. Anyway, there's no rush because they can always enter in later. There is just really not a lot of competition in the market. Well, guess what? Asmodee is now the 800-pound gorilla in the hobby market. So if I was, part of Hasbro or Mattel, I would be looking at Asmodee and going, we are not going to let Asmodee have this whole market for themselves. Now there's kind of one big competitor. Are they going to let that slide, or are they going to try to compete with that? I would think it's a very strong possibility you'll see more from Hasbro and Mattel in the next 5 to 10 years. They don't have to come in from the start. Like, they don't have to... Like, what Mattel's done is they've had their own, in-house developers, and they've made some good games that just didn't really get a whole lot of traction in the hobby. But they're not limited to that. They can license games, and they've done that with Blockus, for example, and Apples to Apples. They might own the rights to both of those, but they used to be with other companies, right? So if a small company has a surprise hit, I think more likely now, instead of that surprise hit staying with that little company and allowing that little company to grow, instead, the bigger companies are going to go to those little companies. Hasbro or Mattel or whoever is going to come into that little company and say, hey, you have a hit on your hands. We will buy the rights to that game, or we'll license the game from you. And we're going to put it in department stores. It's going to be great. And we'll write you a big fat check right now. We'll give you royalties. Very few small companies are going to turn that up. The hobby market has become more and more insular, more and more kind of inward looking. And it's just feeding off itself, right? Companies are giving what hobbyists say they want. And they're giving it to them. And hobbyists are buying them. And what's happening is the games are becoming more and more complex. And the interaction between players is becoming less and less. I believe, and it might not happen in 5 or 10 years, but maybe in 20 years or something, who knows, people are going to look at Eurogames now, like the complex Eurogames, as some weird offshoot. People will look at those Eurogames the way we might now look at war games. Completely legit, and if you're into those games, all the power to you, but the number of people who play them will actually kind of decrease a little bit, and there'll be just kind of this weird kind of offshoot of the hobby, just kind of separate. Of course, you're going to get like crossovers and that, but that kind of Eurogame kind of crowd, like I don't go to conventions, but I always hear the stories of, there's lots of conventions where there's like one room off to the side. That's the war game room. People go in there, they spend the whole convention in there just playing these massive war games. I kind of picture that in 20 years will be the Eurogame room. There'll be a bunch of old people, puzzling over some, Vital Lacerda game or something, because it's becoming kind of a parody of itself, or it will, until eventually it's just a small group of people are going to be enjoying that, and most of the hobby will be off doing something else. That might be a little bit of wishful thinking, though. I do wonder, because, 3D printers are becoming more and more common, and I wonder how that will affect the market for the Kickstarter games with tons of minis. If at some point, and it might not be in 5 or 10 years, but if we reach the point where every family, every household has a 3D printer, and it's not that big a deal to print out basically anything you want, what will the market be for board games that previously would just had tons of minis and that was the selling point? I wonder if we'll ever reach the point where when people want to play a game, that the game you buy will be kind of a basic presentation, but you can trick it out yourself, right? I can picture somebody just buying a chessboard and making all the chess pieces themselves, and then with a 3D printer, and they can make whatever style they want, So I wonder if that could be the same thing for a lot of these board games that rely on minis. And then my mind starts to jump to, will there be then a market for a good, solid core of a game that doesn't rely on the minis to sell it, but relies on itself being a good game in and of itself? If you made the minis yourself, would you buy Rising Sun? I have not played Rising Sun. Maybe the game is just amazing that it doesn't need the minis, and it would be a super popular hit if not for the minis. But anyway, there would definitely be some games where that's the case, right? Where the game is a huge hit because of the minis, but if you replace the minis with cardboard standees, nobody would be interested in the game because the base of the game, the core of the game just isn't interesting enough. So I wonder then if we may see that as a way of bringing in some of these next step games, what we used to call next step games or bridge games, games like Samurai, Mexica, and all these ones that, you know, you could buy it, but also you can just say buy the board or something, and then you have the rules set, and then you just print out the pieces on your own. I wonder what's going to happen to those games that rely on minis when everybody has a 3D printer. And maybe there'll be more interest in getting a game that's good regardless of the components, and you could just buy a simple basic board game and you can trick it out yourself if you want to, but the game itself is kind of cheap. So we might see a reversal. We might see, you know, because you have the games, and games sometimes are made kind of cheap, but then over time the game quality became better and better, and then the hobbyists started to have more expectations, right? And now we're in this kind of ridiculous zone where you have, you know, Foundations of Rome, which I backed, by the way, because Emerson Matsuuchi, he's a great designer. But it's in a cube of a box, and it has crazy components. They're good, and I believe, because I have confidence in that designer, that the game itself is solid. You know, there's got to be a point where it's just not sustainable. $1,000 game, $2,000 game, well, what's the limit? But there has to be a limit. And when that limit is reached, you're going to see a hard turn in the other direction. And I'm just thinking maybe that's a possibility. Maybe there'll be an interest again for games that just have the basic, that are solid games, solid rule sets, you know, but the presentation itself is super simple. But since you have a 3D printer, you don't care, right? You get Samurai, you'll make your own pieces. You can choose how the 3 types of pieces are represented in your copy of Samurai. I think it's an interesting thought experiment. I don't know when or how we'd get there, but I think it's interesting. So you're seeing video gamers more and more enter the board game space. On the one hand, that's great. Welcome to discover these games. But what you'll see is the market changing to accommodate video gamers, in particular the hardcore video gamers. So you already have seen it. This part's not really a prediction, right? There are board games and card games that you see coming out nowadays that, based on the way it's presented or the art style, doesn't feel like a board game from 10 years ago, right? There's something about the now, and it kind of matches that aesthetic that you see in video games a lot. And because that hobby market, for some reason, the hobby market's always over here. Did you notice that? This is the normies over here. This is the hardcore hobby market on this side for some reason. This thing. But you're seeing video gamers. Video games will enter that space too. Video game fans will make board games. And they will try to make board games like video games. Now, how do you do that? Well, you're already seeing it in terms of the art style. You're seeing a lot of you're seeing more unique fantasy themes, like that swords and sorcery / fairy tale kind of fantasy setting that is so common in video games. You're seeing that all the time in board games. But there's lots of other video games out there. And what I think, possible future, not a prediction, but a possible future, is you'll see more board and card games aiming at more of the real dedicated video gamer, like more of a hardcore video gamer. Maybe you'll see more mature themes in board games. And by mature, I hate that word, because to me, mature means for adults in terms of something adults would be interested in. But a lot of times people use the word mature to mean like in that kids are not allowed to see it. But a lot of those things, like a lot of video games, are not for kids, but I wouldn't call them mature either. They're for teens or something, right? So you've got the cheesecake, tons of cheesecake in video games, and hey, board games ever since the old days have, some board games have had a problem with cheesecake, and it's not something I'm particularly proud of because I don't like gatekeeping, and that's what it is. Because when people play those types of board games and they present them to other people, that's a big turnoff to a lot of people, and they're going to decide board games aren't for them. So I hate that sort of thing. But if a hobby board games are just caring about themselves, they don't care about bringing in new people, right, evangelizing, they can just make games that they would be interested in. And so I think you may see more violent board and card games, at least, more depictions of violence, like more rougher than what you might even see now. You'll probably see a return maybe to more cheesecake. We've had cheesecake in the past. I call it cheesecake. I hope you're okay with that term. I just don't want to get into like details about how sometimes women are portrayed. So I call it cheesecake because it's obviously catering to the male gaze, right? And you know what? Lately, there's been a real pushback against that, which I'm super happy about. If the board game hobby market or just the hobby market becomes more inward looking and just focus on itself, then you might see more of that. They're just making games for themselves. I'm not saying it'll definitely happen, but it's a possibility. As long as the hobby market becomes more and more inward looking and more video gamers enter the board game space, everybody can love games. But when you enter kind of more of a hardcore hobby, then what you're seeing is that there's only a certain core group or like there's a stereotypical gamer that people who make games will try to make for that stereotypical gamer. And you see it in video games all the time. They seem to be marketing the games toward, teenage and young adult males, right? And they often don't seem to really care that their presentation is a big turnoff to other people because they're focused on that stereotype of the typical video gamer. And if they have the impression, people who make board games or new people coming in making board games have the impression that the average board gamer is like that, you're going to see more board games aiming at that market, which means more cheesecake, more mature themes. And by mature, I mean not that adults will be interested in them, but just not for kids, right? I think what you'll start seeing, and maybe it's already happened, if so, I've missed it. I'm just thinking off the top of my head here. But I think that hobbyists will start to think of games like Catan and Ticket to Ride as kids' games. And because this is a relatively easy prediction to make, actually, because you can definitely see it from games in the past. If you look at games like Monopoly and Clue and Risk, I think a long time ago, they were just considered board games. They weren't necessarily kids' board games any more than, kids were the ones who most often play board games, right? But certainly games like Catan, Ticket to Ride, Carcassonne, when they came out, they were enjoyed by all sorts of different people, and probably mostly adults. And of course, the adults would introduce that to their kids, right, when they discovered board games. And those people grew up with those games. They grew up, they were kids when they played Catan and Carcassonne. So there'll be the view among more and more hobbyists that light games like Catan, Carcassonne, Ticket to Ride, are kids' games. Films, it used to be like most movies were for everybody, right? Everybody could enjoy the movies because there wasn't really a lot of real serious, adult content in them. They were almost all of them were family friendly. But what you started seeing is you saw more and more movies that were rated, R, basically, right? At least here in North America, rated R, movies that kids are not allowed to see. And even though you have companies like Pixar that are still making movies for all ages, games that movies that kids can enjoy and adults can enjoy, just like Pixar, there can be a perception among some people that movies that kids can enjoy are movies for kids. And I'm an adult. I'm not interested in a kids' movie. I want to watch a movie for adults. That is absolutely a thing in film, and I think you'll see it in board games too. Games that can be enjoyed by kids, Catan and Ticket to Ride and Bonanza and all those lighter games, will be viewed more and more by hobbyists, and I'm not sure, maybe even just regular people, as kids' games. In part because they were kids when they first learned them, so they know kids can play them. But also that tendency to think that if something can be enjoyed by kids and adults, that it's really for kids. And adults sometimes look for things that are just for adults. So I think you'll see that. So you'll see people just, maybe look for games that have more mature content because they don't want to be seen as playing a kid's game. But you might also see those mass market games, including the licensed games. There are some great licensed games that come out now, like Jaws and Villainous and Horrified, right? And there's some great, these are actually really good games, but they're relatively light in that a lot of times kids can play them. So I think that hobbyists will look down on anything mass market, just like we used to look down on Monopoly and Clue, and well, still do, but ever since we were in the hobby, we're like, oh, these games are much better. I don't want to play that mass market crap. Well, you know what? The new hobbyists are going to say the same thing about those family-friendly, those gateway games, the games like Catan and Hoity Toity and Bonanza and Carcassonne and Ticket to Ride and all those games, because they're mass market. There'll be an assumption that they're junk and that they're probably only kids would like those. I'm a hobbyist. I'm an adult. I like more mature games. And there you go. There's that gatekeeping. Anytime you have a hobby, there will always be gatekeeping, because you'll always have people who will be like, we are the real hobbyists. And there's somebody coming out over here and say, hey, I like these things. And they're like, oh, you like that, do you? Well, no, I'm interested in more. Okay, sure. Here, try this. See how you like it. Oh, that's a little bit too involved or complicated. I don't want that. That's not really what I'm interested in. You're not a real hobbyist then. There'll always be gatekeeping. And there was gatekeeping before, but I'm just describing to you what I think, what form gatekeeping will take in the hobby in the future. I think we might see a competitor to BoardGameGeek. Now, this is an interesting topic. I just feel like BoardGameGeek is trying to be everything to everybody. And they're focused. People who go to a website dedicated to board games can probably call themselves hobbyists, right? I mean, BoardGameGeek was my gateway. I didn't really know about those games, but I knew about BoardGameGeek as a repository of board game information. And just when I explored it, that's when I discovered these games of ours, these great games. So you could argue that anybody who is visiting BoardGameGeek is already a hobbyist, but I can say from my own personal experience that that's not the case. BoardGameGeek has done a very good job of trying to appeal to everyone, in that they obviously know that a lot of the discussion, or most of the discussion, will be on the real hardcore hobby stuff. But you have people like Eric Martin, the editor of Board Game News, who, obviously can play that stuff, but he has a love of lighter games like card games, and you can see that when he kind of does a little presentation in video form of a game, you can see where his interest lies. And you look at video content like Game Night, right? They also do a good job of they do hobby games, but a lot of the stuff they do are kind of lighter fare. So BoardGameGeek is trying to appeal to everyone, and I appreciate that. I have a long time love of BoardGameGeek. I'm not going to lie. Earlier, I was talking about the smaller companies just going the Kickstarter route, and you'll have the big guys. You'll have Asmodee. You'll have Ravensburger, Cosmos, Amigo, maybe. Maybe you'll see Hasbro and Mattel. Let's talk about Asmodee specifically. I would think Asmodee may want to kind of curate the sort of type of content that fans of their games are going to want to see. If they have a lot of games that appeal to mass market, or mass market plus, let's say that, obviously they do hobby games too, there's no doubt about that, and I believe Asmodee and BoardGameGeek have a very good relationship. But I can see Asmodee, having these games in their, their repertoire, games like Ticket to Ride and that. If they want to send people to a website to find out more information about these games, it may not be in Asmodee's best interest to send them to BoardGameGeek. I would say a lot of the users aren't particular fans of Asmodee, considering how they've gobbled up a lot of these small companies that had their own, following of fans. But of course, people on BoardGameGeek are talking about lots of different games, and probably most of them aren't Asmodee games. So you might see Asmodee, and maybe even some other companies too, with Asmodee. I don't even know. But I just want to narrow the focus. Let's talk about Asmodee. I personally think that Asmodee may look at as sort of a competitor to BoardGameGeek. At least they want a website that they can send their fans to. If a regular person, they buy Ticket to Ride in the store, they play it and they love it, and they think, oh my god, board games are great for me and my family, I want to find out more information. It'd be great if Asmodee had information in the box to be like, oh, find out more games, right? Go to this website. And that website's not going to be BoardGameGeek. So there's at least two possibilities, and these are websites that Asmodee already owns. One is Board Game Arena, which is, of course, predominantly a place where you play board games, but they have a forum. So you could totally see that forum expanding, right? Here's a website where you can go to learn more about games and also play them, right? A lot of Asmodee games will be on Board Game Arena. And they also own Trick Track. Trick Track is basically the French version of BoardGameGeek. It's not exactly the same thing. Trick Track was doing original content long before BoardGameGeek did. But knowing that Asmodee owns a website that's kind of like BoardGameGeek, in that it's a discussion place, it's a place where you can learn about new games and that, why not? Maybe Asmodee will take Trick Track and grow it. Maybe we'll see an English version of Trick Track. Asmodee still is into the hobby market. They own Fantasy Flight Games. They're still making hobby games that only hobbyists really would be interested in. But if they have a lot of market share in terms of these games of ours, especially ones that are like gateway games, it is in their best interests to introduce more games to them in a sort of a curated form, right? A way that Asmodee can introduce games to their own fans, and of course introduce more Asmodee games. So they can be hobby games, or they can be next step up games, right? But keeping that within kind of the Asmodee bubble. It's a possibility, but I don't think BoardGameGeek's going to go anywhere. But maybe BoardGameGeek will focus a little bit more toward the hobby market, even more than it's already doing now. Maybe over time, this is long term now, maybe Asmodee with their social media board game site, whether it's Trick Track or Board Game Arena, focuses more on Asmodee games, and most of which are kind of more accessible games. And then the hobbyists, maybe people are perfectly fine to stay within that Asmodee bubble. And if they want to explore and kind of find out more about kind of the hardcore hobby games, that's when they start going to BoardGameGeek. None of that is a definite, right? BoardGameGeek will still be an amazing repository of information, including about Asmodee games. And Asmodee will still make hobby games, and those hobby games will be on BoardGameGeek. But I'm just saying, possible future, you might see that. Right now, there isn't really a market for games like I'll say the ones I always mention. For some reason, the one that always pops in my head first is Samurai. Samurai, Through the Desert, Medici, Modern Art, of course, all Knizia games, but also like Mexica and, oh my gosh, so many others, right? That were considered next step games. Games that anybody could enjoy, but they're really enjoyed on another level for hobbyists, right? Anybody could learn Samurai. If they can learn Monopoly, they could play Samurai. Doesn't mean they'll have fun, doesn't mean they'll enjoy it, but Samurai is not a complicated game, right? But who is that game for now? Because the hobbyists want more hardcore games. They want more that kind of feed their desire for novelty and complexity and intricate puzzles. So I just feel like now there isn't really any room for those types of games. Often the games that I feature on the channel, games like Mexico, right? But it doesn't have to be that way. When I look at my own path in board games, I played Monopoly and Risk as a kid. And then later on, I would also play like Scrabble and Uno, like with my family, right? And then eventually I discovered games like Samurai and Raw and Through the Desert and all those ones, right? And that was my path. There are some people who are starting on like Trajan and stuff, right? There are people who are starting with kind of more of the complex Euros, but there are people who enter board games from Catan, Ticket to Ride. They start there. For me, that was like a middle ground, right? We started with Monopoly and Risk, and then we graduated to Catan and Ticket to Ride, and then we moved on to games like Samurai and Mexica. Well, there are people who enter at Catan and Ticket to Ride, and they never leave. That's completely fine, too. You enjoy what you want. If you like that type of game, nothing wrong with liking Catan, all right? Despite I meet people now, and they're apologetic. Like I said, so what kind of games do you like? And they're like, well, when I was a kid, I liked to play Catan, I mean, I didn't know any better, right? But we were kids. We didn't know. We played Catan, and I know it's a bad game, but, super apologetic. Nothing wrong with liking Catan. What's wrong with liking Catan? And there are people who will stay at that level. That's completely fine. But what if they want to explore, right? Are they going to jump? Because now there's a gap. Are they going to jump to games like Trajan? Or are there next step games for them? And I think there's a huge potential, because I'm looking at this wedge, this gap, right? The board gaming has gone like this. And these games that I love are caught in here, this void. And the hobby market has already decided they're not that interested in these anymore. So, who are these games for? Somebody's got to like them, right? They're good games. They can be the next step for people who like Catan and like Ticket to Ride. But they don't want to, play a 3-hour game of Magic Riders of Mid-Deep, right? Like, they're just not interested in that sort of thing, right? But they'd be interested in Catan Plus, in Ticket to Ride Plus, right? They like Catan. Maybe they like Cities of, what is it? I've never actually played it. The expansion for Catan, not Seafarers, the other one. Cities and Knights of Catan, right? And Cities and Knights makes Catan a more involved game, but because Catan itself is already understood, it's not much more effort to learn the expansion on top of that and kind of, grow from there. So you have the basic game, which everybody can enjoy and is relatively easy to learn. And if you want a more involved experience, you have expansions. You have expansions to do that. And if not expansions, there can also be games like Mexica, like Samurai, right? I want to say like Scrabble, okay? Now, Scrabble's a mass market game, but it doesn't have some of the stigma that older games like Monopoly and Risk does, right? Scrabble has sort of a perception as being a kind of a mature game, in the real sense of mature, as in a game that adults would be interested in. It's a little bit thinky, right? Still an element of randomness, and it possesses an interesting position in the market as a board game that doesn't feel like it's for kids. And 4 adults could sit down and play and have a great time and don't feel like they're childish playing it. Get some of these big companies, like Asmodee, but also like Hasbro and Mattel and that, they can get the rights to some of these old classic great games. But instead of marketing them toward the hobby, aim them toward mass market, right? You buy a copy of Catan, and in the box, there's a flyer for some more games. And, some of them are simple like Catan, and some of them are just another step up. I think some of these companies have a real opportunity. This isn't a prediction. I have no reason to think that any of them will actually do this. This is more of a wish than anything else, if I'm honest. But I think some of those big companies can, in several years, after people have forgotten about these recent reprints of the games, but when it's time to be reprinted again, have these big companies look like the ones that focus on the mass market, take these games and present them anew, not to hobbyists, but to the mass market. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be everywhere. It doesn't mean you're going to find, Samurai in Target, okay? But, people can easily buy stuff on Amazon. They just have to know about it, right? If you know about it, you can easily find online where to buy it. That's not a problem, but they have to know about it. So the big companies have an opportunity to grow their side of the hobby. I got to be careful using the word hobby, because I'm not talking about hardcore hobbyists over here, right? I'm talking about people who just like board games as a pastime, right? And their hobby is playing board games, but they're not playing the hardcore Euros or the dungeon crawls or whatever. They're just playing stuff like Catan and Ticket to Ride. How does that market grow? Of course, you'll still be selling them, Ticket to Ride Europe and Ticket to Ride Nordic countries or whatever, right? You'll still sell expansions, you'll still sell spin-offs, but companies like Asmodee need to think about how to grow their part of the hobby. They need to figure out how to grow the mass market side of the hobby. And a lot of these games I talk about on the channel, the original gems, the OGs, I actually don't talk about them very much. I usually talk about kind of the more obscure stuff, but I'm always saying great things about games like Medici and Modern Art and to a lesser degree Raw. These great games, and there's a potential for everybody to enjoy these games. They're not hard games to learn, as long as they're presented in the right light, not as kids' games, and not something that only people deep into the hobby would play, but something that casual people can play and still enjoy. And, but once they've played it a couple times, there's a depth to it, right? The third game of Mexica is going to be very different from the first game of Mexica. Again, this is probably wishful thinking on my part. I don't want to think that games like Samurai and Medici and that are dated. And it's like, well, they're a product of their time. Nobody be interested in those games now. I refuse to believe that, okay? These games are still great. And we just have to figure out who are they for. For whom are these board games? Games are for everyone, or can be for everyone. Literally, every culture has games. And if a culture plays Mancala and they think that's cool, great, right? That doesn't mean it's for kids. Mahjong isn't for kids, right? Lots of card games you play. If you play Spade or Bridge or Big Two, those aren't necessarily kids' games, right? They're games that anybody can enjoy once they learn the rules. So I think companies like Asmodee now have a real opportunity to grow that side of the pastime. Let's put it that way. Not the hobby, because that implies something else, but the pastime. The market for board games among regular people. These games are for someone. And we've already decided the hobby market is not that someone. Why? Because the hobby market used to be this. Now the hobby market is this. Right? And there's a gap there. That's where these games are. They're for someone. We have to find out who that someone is. That's my idea. You know what? This may not come to pass. I don't know. Like I said, these are not predictions. They're just kind of fun thought exercises. They're possible futures. I don't have a huge amount of influence, but I try to do that with my restaurants, right? I try to present board games in more of a light of, everyone can enjoy board games, not, it's just something for hardcore hobbyists. And I don't think I'm the only one. And I do know, I can see in my tiny little part of the board game industry, I can see there's potential there. And it is wishful thinking, but I do hope that's a possible future that does come to pass. I want to thank the person who asked this question very much for asking it. I think it's a really great topic, really interesting. I know this is probably a long video. I haven't edited yet, but it's probably going to need a lot of editing. It's probably pretty long. Thanks so much for listening to it and listening to my ramblings. Don't forget, all right? Older games don't stop being good just because newer games come out. All right, take care.